Hello, and welcome to the Spoonie Authors Podcast, a podcast where we explore the life and stories of a different disabled author each week. I'm your host, Diana Gunn, and joining me today is Alex Harrow. Alex Harrow is a queer and non-binary author of science fiction and fantasy with LGBTQ plus protagonists. When not writing queerness with a chance of explosions, Alex is a high school English teacher waging epic battles against comma splices and misused apostrophes. Their debut science fiction novel, Empire of Light, was released with 9 Star Press in 2019. Hello, Alex.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It is so great to have you on the show. I'm very excited. I must say I love your shirt, which has 3 adorable little cats on it.
Yep. Trans kitty representation.
I am a big sucker for cats of all colors. I will admit I would love to have a blue cat in real life. One of the cats on your shirt is blue, and I would love to have a blue cat in real life, and I'm genuinely sad that I can't.
It's sad. Like I pretend my 2 gray ones are actually blue. I'm like, look, this is just the convenient disguise.
Yes, it is just to, not confuse the mortals.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so tell us about your novel, Empire of Light.
Empire of Light came out earlier last year, earlier in 2019, 2015. Yeah, let's go back in time. And it is all about Damien Nettoyer, who is an assassin for the Empire of Light, who conveniently takes out whoever they want him to take out in exchange for protection for him and his friends, and namely his partner Eris, who has a psychokinetic ability called the Voyance that would normally get him essentially lobotomized by the government because magic is a bad thing and volatile and all of these things. But as he's working for the Empire, he gets roped into helping out a revolutionary named Rain, who he's hired to take out, but it turns out he gets his ass kicked and roped into Rain's revolution instead, which brings him on the other side of the Empire and turns him in turn into sort of a one-man revolution, especially when the Empire double-crosses him and betrays him and his friends. So it's I often pitch it as a book that's full of queerness with a chance of explosions and gay firefly with magic. So if you're here for that kind of found family space opera feel, Empire of Light is your book.
Awesome. I must admit, I love science fantasy when magic and science are combined.
Yeah,
so I'm kind of like very excited about this book.
I like the genre mashing of it, and it was kind of funny while I was writing it. I was like, is this more fantasy? Is it more sci-fi? It's kind of like space opera if space opera took place on an alternate Earth. We're not actually in space, but characters do live on a spaceship, and space travel never took off because now we're dealing with a shortage of resources, so it's a little bit dystopian. Like, it's really kind of my love child of all of these genres mixed up, so we're just going to let it be everything.
Is that something you set out to do, or is that just how the story evolved?
Honestly, it's just how the story evolved. At first, like as a writer, and this is my debut and really like my first book that has made it through multiple iterations. I definitely explored a lot of genre along the way and kind of realized like, hey, while learning a lot about genre expectations and genre limitations, I also constantly kind of like pushed against those boxes and decided, you know what, to hell with it. I'm just going to break out of these boxes and mash it all together. Let's make a bigger box. Let's make a more complicated box. It's fun. They're guns and explosions. It's all good. And kissing and sex scenes, like, because let's throw in some romance as well. So it's kind of a little bit of everything. It's like my weird chameleon sort of book.
I love that. And what inspired you to start this story?
Honestly, it was kind of a mix of wanting to see more queer representation. Like specifically when I first started writing, which was in my early 20s, I had still barely discovered queer books at all. Like I remember reading Lynn Fluelling's Shadowrunner series or Night Runner series and realizing, wait, this is a fantasy book that has queer protagonists, specifically like a gay protagonist and a bi protagonist, and they're fine. Like their queerness isn't like, yeah, there's some drama related to it, but it's not like the source of their tragedy, and it's not like, oh, their story is definitely bound to end badly. And I kind of got hooked on it, honestly. Like from there, I checked out other things like Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness that messed with gender, and it was like, oh wait, like yeah, what if a species could change their gender, like dependent on like a cycle? Like what would this be like? And I just wanted more of it. So I kind of had discovered the crack of queer books. And I was like, okay, more please. And I also realized, oh, the best way to get more of this is to write it. And so I kind of like dove into that and explored a lot of myself, frankly, through it as well. Like there was a lot of like, ooh, do I get to write the characters I'm writing? Like how do I fit into that with my own identity? And figured out a lot of that along the way, where it's like, oh, why is it easier for me to write male characters? Why do I like gender bend and like break gender roles for basically all of my characters? Why is that? Oh, yeah, I'm totally cis. And in the process of that, like a lot of that came to light. Like a lot of like it gave me a lot of like freedom to explore these things, but a lot of it also kind of almost subconsciously made it into this book. So it's a lot of that. It's a lot of wanting to see more of that, a lot of self exploration, and honestly, also quite a lot of spite. Like I had people tell me, specifically, most notoriously, a advanced creative writing professor while I was doing my English major undergrad studies in an advanced fiction writing class. She told us, oh yeah, I don't want to see any of that content. And that content conveniently was anything that was queer and specifically sexually queer. And I basically got up and left that class after that first session and decided, you know what, I'm going to show you what's what. And yeah, spoiler alert, I got published and she's no longer teaching. So I think I win. So a lot of spite, like living in a conservative state and kind of figuring out who I am as an author and as a person, how do I fit into this, definitely played a role. Like I kind of do a lot out of spite sometimes. Just how it goes.
I think that's a common thing, especially for, people like yourselves who are very queer and very left-leaning and are stuck in very, very conservative states and other places around the world.
Yeah, it's kind of like finding that space too. Like for me, a lot of it was also finding community. Like at first, I like definitely failed massively. Like I remember going to my first writing conference in 2009 and mentioning that I was writing gay books, and I got this look of like, blink, blink. That's okay, and people would like literally back away. And by now it almost has reverted. Like by now I co-organize conferences here. I'm like super involved in the writing community in Utah. So but I also moved like to Salt Lake City, which is more the liberal bubble of Utah. So it's a lot of like finding your community and finding your people associated with that. But there's definitely a lot of, okay, let me like rub up against like these things and see how that's going. Definitely a lot of a lot of those encounters that were not exactly the most pleasant.
Yeah, that's unfortunately a common experience as we are learning more and more. It's simultaneously heartening to see that people are actually discussing things and disheartening to think that, all of this stuff has just been going under the radar for so long.
Yeah, it's honestly awesome that we are creating more spaces for marginalized authors, that people of color are getting more of a boost now, which I hope is a thing that we're going to continue. It's not just like, oh, like, let's celebrate Pride in 1 month, or let's like boost Black voices or people of color or disabled people in specific times, but let's make that like a constant part of who we are, because honestly, there's so many cool stories and books and perspectives. That should just be a thing. So I'm hoping that's where we're getting, but
Absolutely. That is really what that's the hope. That's why we exist. That's why this podcast is here, to hopefully get these stories out and to show people that the stories are here. I
yeah,
think a lot of people just assume that they aren't because they aren't the books that are, promoted all of the time, and people just sort of read whatever is spoon-fed to them, right?
yeah. Oh, definitely. Like I remember even when I was first looking for books that had any queer representation in it, looking at just Big Five books, like the Big Five publishers, was extremely limiting. It was really like, then I like explored like all of these other avenues that I hadn't even known about. But that's because back like 10 years ago, people like the industry wasn't what it's today. Like it's definitely evolved a lot, and kind of hoping that indie authors and smaller authors are like getting more and more of a platform throughout this. So publishing is multifaceted. Let's explore that, and yeah, let's give these authors bigger deals as well. Like that needs to happen.
Yeah, like I saw, there was the publishing paid me hashtag that was going around Twitter, and someone apparently got an $800,000 advance.
Yes. That was
If you had
wild.
just split that money between 4 marginalized writers, they would have still been happy,
Seriously.
happy as the days are long to have received $200,000.
Yeah, six-figure advances. Like, wait, what? That's a lot of money. Like, that's like, yeah, more than many of us make in years. So,
And so what has been the most exciting part about releasing Empire of Light into the world and, bringing this very gay story actually to readers?
honestly, for me, it's been that aspect of finding community and finding an audience that resonated with it, but also, yeah, finding readers and authors to work with. I'm noticing like I learn a lot from the writing community every single day, like whether that's like reviews, which I am one of those people who read their own reviews. I don't engage with them, but I definitely look at them and go like, okay, like how does this resonate with me? What can I do better? From that aspect, like I've been learning a lot about that. But honestly, for me, also a lot of the publishing experience itself, like the fact that once you're publishing a book, like it is not just a solo effort, it becomes a team effort. You work with editors, you work with graphic designers. Like working with my cover artist has been fantastic. And Natasha Snow is so good. Like I'm so grateful for her work and her asking everyone for the kind of input she does. But finding like a community in like with Nine Star, like they are a small LGBTQ publisher, but with that comes kind of like that sort of family style community, like with people really helping each other and kind of just becoming friends outside of just publishing. I really personally love going to conferences. I love presenting at places, selling books at cons. Like all of that is super fun. Like I'm kind of hoping to soon do that again if we ever get out of this pandemic state of, not being able to leave the house. Like I'm in Utah right now. We are one of the states where cases are just rising, and our state is doing sadly very little on a state level and is leaving it all up to local levels. So it's a bit wild and scary, but I'm really missing that personal connection as well. Like I love the online community, but then also the in-person stuff on top of it just really makes that like even more real and even more tangible.
Yeah, there's definitely something really cool about actually hanging out with a group of writers face to face, and it's definitely something that I miss as well.
Yeah.
Although it was never a huge part of my life, I admit conferences tend to be too large for me and are just overwhelming.
That's a
I
good
can't do
point.
more than like one or two a year.
Hmm.
There's a lot of spoons expended, and they aren't necessarily very accessible for me because of my location. So,
That's actually been something that's been really interesting during this whole pandemic thing, which I co-organize a conference. It's the League of Utah Writers Quills Conference. And one of the things that we discovered, we usually do a spring workshop that's just like a 1 day workshop at a local campus. But this year we made it all online, which meant like pre-recorded presentations and then some live components like Q&As and like Zoom rooms for people to hang out and stuff like that. But one of the things that it did was it made it much more accessible, not just for like people that are local or for people who before were like struggling with accessibility. Like it's always been like, yeah, we're at a campus, so fortunately there are elevators there. There's access to facilities, but at the same time, it's getting people there, being able to take time off work. Like if you have an online conference, you can make things available longer and accessible at people's own pace. So you don't have that like overwhelm of like loading up on a bunch of content in like 1 or 2 days. Instead, you can kind of pace it out and like take it at your own space. So kind of wondering like how much of this like as we're doing things more and more online will open up more accessibility specifically for people with disabilities or people who just otherwise would not have access to these things because of their location, because of finances, like all of these things. And I feel like that's really like a debate that's getting opened up, and I'm hoping that people will continue that past this pandemic because it really just shows us like, oh, a lot of things can be done much more accessibly and should be done like in that vein. So
yeah, I think that's something that's really important to consider um, moving forward is we've made like all of these things are suddenly accessible to disabled people. How do we make at least some of these things stay accessible to
mhm.
disabled people beyond the pandemic? Of course, right now, just trying to think beyond the pandemic is a lot.
Yeah, we don't know when it's going to end. And obviously, yeah, it also impacts other things, but I feel like accessibility is kind of like the key theme that ties a lot of things together, whether it's, jobs that were totally doable remotely, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, you can do this remotely. Okay, hi, then maybe hire some more disabled people. Maybe restructure your company leadership to include more people of color, more marginalized people. Like I feel like all of this is kind of coming to a head. For me as an educator, I see the same thing where accessibility to technology, where it's like, yeah, it's still a luxury to have a functioning internet connection, to have a computer in a house. Like it's like all of these things that people often take for granted that are in fact not. And how do we, as a society, broach this and make this more of a focus? Is I think like a really interesting layer of that and kind of a key layer when it comes to like equitable access to everything.
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about how the pandemic is impacting communities and accessibility, but what about personally? Are you still writing? How are you getting anything done?
Yeah, for me, honestly, it's been a struggle. Like and honestly, I do this during regular non-pandemic times as well. I'm a person who deals with a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, and often having like literally the spoons to do writing on top of my day job, which is teaching, is like incredibly exhausting. So during these times, I had to like figure out like, hey, what is my schedule actually? Because it seems like time has lost all meaning. Like a lot of us, like, I know I have definitely days where I'm like, it's just one long depression nap. I'm just playing Animal Crossing and maybe reading a bit and feeding my cats. I have succeeded
You
at this
see,
day. And
as
sometimes
someone,
that's
sorry to interrupt, but I have
right.
to, as someone who's worked from home for a long time has always been something I struggled with. And now that all of you people are working from home and struggling with time having no meaning, it's so much harder.
Mhm.
But we're all in this together, and there is at least that camaraderie.
Yeah, and I feel like there is a lot of that aspect of people are suddenly getting like, oh, like some people do this all the time. Like, I have a friend who doesn't deal with any disabilities really, who has been working from home for years, and I'm like, oh, I see now. Like this is how this works. Like it opens up kind of these perspectives. For me personally, like I just have had a lot of what I call brain clutter, where for the good first month of the pandemic, what I've been doing, like I couldn't write on a computer. Like it just wouldn't come. Like I would stare at my document and I'm like, I've got nothing. Like somehow I wrote this. I don't know how to fix it. Like, what do you want from me, dear manuscript? And so, one of the things I had to kind of do is reroute that. For whatever reason, for me, maybe it's the tactile element, but when I'm writing by hand, it almost lets me explore things with less pressure. So I actually filled like an entire notebook in April. Like I was just journaling every day and doing writing prompts and things like that. But I also had to really learn to allow myself to take off some of the pressure where like we had that discussion even with my publisher where they were saying like, hey, we're all dealing with this. So if you need extensions, like please communicate that. Like we're willing to work with people. And having that sort of understanding definitely helped. For me personally, I definitely had to work on the whole idea of giving myself permission to not just be nonstop productive, where it was like, okay, this is a huge mindset shift. How do I function within that, and what does that mean, and what is like a functional routine for me, and also just kind of dealing with like some days it just doesn't work out. Like I just had major surgery where I was like totally not writing for about 2 weeks because you're on like major painkillers and you're in a lot of physical pain and you can't really like sit up for any like longer amounts and things like that. And working around that as well has been super interesting and kind of eye-opening because I have writer friends who deal with chronic pain every day, where it's like, okay, how do you make this work and um, are still writing and are still like pursuing things. And it's, I think, just kind of also embracing that some days are really good and you can move ahead and some days are not, and letting that be okay has definitely been a shift for me.
Absolutely. um Sorry, I just had a brain fart.
Brain clutter, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, it's more like, a brain ejection. Like there was brain clutter and now it's just suddenly all gone and there's literally nothing left.
Mhm. I feel like that's also been like symptomatic for a lot of these days where it's just like, okay, that there were things there and there were writing spoons like in my day and suddenly they're gone. It's like what happened? Because something else happened, or like it's, I
Wow.
think, also hard to not be constantly glued to like the news or social media. Like I think establishing boundaries is like another thing where it's like, okay, like both your boundary of like how involved are you with everything else that's going on, also what's your role in this, like what are things that you can actually do and that are empowering and healthy, and what are things that are really destructive behaviors. Like for me, a lot of it comes down to like, even as a published author, your imposter syndrome and your tendency to like react in ways that are really trauma responses never really goes away, and you kind of have to hold that in check, has definitely been a thing. where it's kind of like, okay, brain, nope, we're not doing this right now. Like, you're going to write for even just like a 10-minute sprint or a 15-minute sprint. That's been super helpful for me, because when you're looking at like hours and hours of time that you're like, okay, I'm going to write for 3 hours now. Like, no, that's not working. You have to like break that up into smaller chunks and just go with that. That's been way better for me personally, because that way you still have accomplished something. Like, if I just sit down and write for 15 minutes today, I'll still have accomplished more than just staring at nothing for 3 hours. So that's been super helpful, along with something else that a writing group is doing that I'm in, is we kind of do daily accountability check-ins, just kind of like, hey, what have you gotten done? What are your goals for today? And you know what, if writing isn't on your goal today, that's cool. Like, have you eaten? Have you hydrated? Have you taken your meds? Like, I just barely found a new therapist, so that's a huge accomplishment, because that's definitely not easy right now either. Because, oh, it's pandemic times. Everyone needs a therapist. Yeah, that's
I mean, finding the right therapist is never easy to begin with.
Yeah, especially if you need someone who has like knowledge about like queerness and transness and all of these things. Like, I definitely had that situation where I had a video in a like consult with someone, and it just kept going like, oh, like she just would say things, and I'm like, whoa, this is a massive red flag. And how do you interact with that at the moment? And then after, it's just like, okay, I don't think this was not great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's doubly hard to enforce boundaries right now because our whole social lives have kind of been forced online. But there should be differences in the way we interact with the online world, especially if you're on, a public medium like Twitter.
Oh, absolutely.
Versus in a room with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big struggle because it's so much easier to just say something that you're going to regret later, or to say something that is interpreted in a regrettable way because people can't see your face or hear your tone of voice, or
you just don't fit like enough nuance into it. Like, I definitely noticed this a lot, like where I'll engage with something on Twitter or any social media, and I even like think like, okay, like personally I'm coming from a place of support, and then notice like, oh, but what I'm saying could also be construed as the exact opposite. And it's like, like there's a lot of like anxiety potential in that as well. Like, it's interesting, like how some people, I feel like a lot of people are like very aware that, hey, this is a public forum, what you put out there is for everyone to see, and others somehow seem to not see that, or seem to like use it as a way to just put out there like whatever is on their mind, and think there won't be any repercussions, but spoilers, there are. So it's a whole thing. Like, we had the situation here with a professor at my former university who was making remarks that were incredibly racist, and he was like, oh yeah, like I shouldn't have done that. And we're like, yeah, but the fact of what you said and the volume and the type of language that you use means you should probably not teach people. Like, it's like undermine like what people are doing. Yeah, in this case it was someone who's teaching criminal justice, so that was in
doubly
what's been going on
awkward.
in June has been intense.
Yeah, it's
I
been.
definitely feel like it's that kind of time where people in some ways are showing who they really are, because for whatever reason the filter between, hey, this is an opinion that I'm putting out there in writing in a way that's documentable and very provable, I think is falling away. Like, somehow I think people are blurring these lines, and it's just like, yeah, it's right there.
Yeah. But I feel like it's a natural consequence of just how digital our lives have become in response to this pandemic. And, it's something to be aware of. And, we're also all a little bit cracked and we're all a little bit weirder than normal.
Mm.
So a lot of the times it's people showing their true colors, and every once in a while it's people reverting into old habits that they shed 10 years ago. And it's a lot to navigate.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of like, hey, who are you really, and how do you interact with others? Like, I've definitely seen a lot of like family members unfriending each other over things. It's like, hey, wear a mask outside. Like, please don't be this person. And it's like, oh, you're arguing at me with science. I must unfriend you. It's like, whoa, okay. Like, it's been really interesting, like how that's like shifted dynamics. Yeah, even how that's like handled, like how it's handled in different countries. I mean, I'm sure like
Yeah.
people are looking at the US going, I know my family in Europe sure does. They're like, are you all okay? Like what's going on? Everything is on fire. I'm like, yeah, but
A little
it's
bit.
also the ripple effects aren't just centralized to the US either. Like seeing like there are like Black Lives Matter protests in Germany. There are things that are like going on where it's like, like the way that the police operates in different countries is very different, but it's still getting criticized because there is just a lot of problematic behavior, a lot of racism, a lot of systemic stuff that needs to be addressed. And I feel like we're at this point where it's kind of like push comes to shove and we have to address it. Like it just can't be overlooked anymore.
Yeah.
But the rough part is that it's usually on marginalized communities to expose that and then hope that what they're saying is being believed and catches on and then results in actual action, not just in activism that's basically just lip service, that people are actually doing something about it as far as they can, which is a whole nother, I think, debate too when it comes to like disability and activism and what that looks like. Like, what do you do when you really want to go out and protest physically, but you physically can't? Like, what are other ways to get involved? What are helpful ways and what are unhelpful ways? Where are like certain boundaries where people shouldn't be overstepping? Like, I feel like all of this like discourse has been super fascinating around that. Like, I know for me as a fairly privileged white person, I definitely learned a lot. Like, I feel like that's kind of been my constant mindset as I'm interacting with social media, as I'm getting like more immersed in different communities. I'm like, okay, let me take a step back and listen and figure out like what's the best way to be supportive here while not taking center stage either. Like I feel like it's that constant like back and forth between like where do you take up space versus where should you just be like a listener and a supporter rather than speaking out yourself or overshadowing others with your own actions. Like it's all like this weird wibbly wobbly balance.
Yeah.
Complicated.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of thinking on all these subjects, and my journals are filling pretty fast these days too. So
Oh yeah, I also have a regrettable fountain pen addiction. I don't know. My writer friends are like, this is not a problem. Like, you're ordering another Twisby fountain pen. This is fine.
you could be addicted to far worse things than fountain
Yeah,
pens.
exactly. It could be, could be things that are actively harming me. Instead, it's coffee and fountain pens. Like, this is fine. And cats.
Yes. Cats are a very important addiction.
Honestly, they're also just very important for sanity. Sometimes
Oh goodness, yes.
I'll get stressed about the world and I'm like, oh, there's like Loki cat. It's just like rub my belly and I'm happy. I'm like, you
No.
know what? You have the right outlook here, cat.
Yeah, it's like everything is awful, but then you go and you squeeze a cat and suddenly everything's just kind of okay again.
Yeah. Or you're like, oh, I really just need to take a nap. And your cats are like, yes. Like, Poe just likes to hang out on my shoulder. Like, he realized that he currently cannot lie on my chest since I just had top surgery. So he's like, okay, I'll just like snuggle up right here and it's good. It's like,
Well, at least he hasn't taken to lying on your face like mine does.
oh yeah, no, I'm glad. I do definitely have the pillow stealer cat who just likes to go like, no, this is my pillow now. Like you, I don't know what you're gonna do with your head, but it's not gonna go here.
No. I have the seat stealer cat. I don't know what you're going to do with your bottom, but it's not going here.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So we are running out of time. So I'm just going to ask you, we have the one question that I like to ask every author who comes on this show, which is how would you like to see disability representation change, not just in books, but in media as a whole in the next few years?
I feel like in general there just needs to be more of it. I like personally I find myself like finding more and more resources when it comes to disability representation. Like there's so many really cool podcasts. Like I just recently discovered the Disability After Dark podcast that specifically talks about like sex and accessibility and like queerness and disability, like those kinds of intersections just need to have more room. So I feel like like shows that are produced or like media that's being made by disabled creators of color, disabled creators who are queer, who are trans, like all of these intersections need to have more space. I feel like we are getting to that point where it's like you don't just cast an able-bodied actor in a disabled role. It's like, no, they're disabled actors that are fabulous, that should be having these roles. There are disabled authors who should be writing their narratives. And yeah, like they're not all necessarily happy or affirming because not all of our narratives are. Like I feel like as we're moving forward, a lot of the impulse often is to gatekeep and to say like, oh, this needs to be only done by this author, or only these narratives are relevant and helpful, when there really is just such a spectrum. And I feel like it's kind of like that box metaphor where it's like if our box is like too small, if we don't have room for that, we need a bigger box. And I think for all media currently, that's just what needs to happen. And I'm like hoping that things will be more and more successful, that we see more, specifically, honestly, big five publishers publishing books about disabled characters. Like I want to see more like autistic space pirates or mermaids who are using wheelchairs, like in Shauna McGuire's books. As her Myra Grant or Mira Grant pseudonym, she writes Into the Drowning Deep, where mermaids are scary and murder people, but they're also these like people who are like, oh yeah, I'm a wheelchair user, but I am like really comfortable in the water. And oh, like characters who are using sign language, who are normalized, who take on leadership roles, like those types of things are what I want to see more of. But I also want to see it from creators that intersect with these identities. So just give me more of all of the things. Let's make the box bigger and bigger, please. Like, let's just not have a box.
I agree.
Falling thing of awesome.
Excellent. I love that. So, all right, that brings us to our final question, which is what are you working on now and where can people go to find out about it?
Yeah, I am currently actually working on the sequel for Empire of Light, which is called Republic of Shadows. It actually deals with a lot of the fallout of book one, so I'm having a lot of fun exploring those things, exploring like specifically trauma and government and how do you navigate new relationships and found family. Found family is generally a theme that's in all of my stuff. I seem to be unable to write anything that isn't super queer and dealing with found family. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Alex Harrow SFF. I'm also occasionally on Facebook. And one thing that I have launched just recently is a YouTube channel, which is also Alex Harrow. If you search that on YouTube, you can find more about like my like gender feels and trans journey, top surgery, like that type of stuff, as well as my website, which is just alexharrow.com. So like looking at writing a lot more in series, but also spin-offs and shorts and kind of everything that comes my way. I seem to like always juggle like at least 2 to 3 things at once. Like I seem to be unable to just do one thing. But right now, the Empire of Light sequel is my main project.
Awesome. That's very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful chatting, and good luck with everything in 2020.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, let's like conquer 2020. I feel like we'll get there.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Spoonie Authors Podcast. The Spoonie Authors Podcast is part of the Spoonie Authors Network, a community initiative devoted to sharing the stories of disabled authors and educating abled people about what life is like for disabled creatives. Transcripts of this podcast are also available on the Spoonie Authors Network. To learn more or become a contributor, visit spoonieauthorsnetwork.blog. And of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast streaming platform.